A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video, but more on that later. So this video will take you through everything I did to transform an empty old shipping container into a watertight, heavily insulated room that will become the base of my fully off-grid home office and editing studio. This is the third shipping container build I've done, so I got to apply a ton of lessons from the first two that made the process significantly more efficient and also resulted in a much higher quality end product. The entire process took about 7 days from start to finish, but I think you could probably get it done in about 3 to 4 if you had a couple more people, a little bit better weather, and aren't building off-grid on top of a mountain. All right, so the first step in the process is marking where the windows and the door are going to go. This step is honestly a little tedious. I've tried using a laser in the past, but it just doesn't seem to work that well for me. So instead, the new system I use is basically just a couple welding magnets, which I place on the wall, and then I clean up the edges of a 2x4 with my table saw, just so that I have a nice, clean, relatively straight, lightweight piece of wood to use to make the markings on the wall. The markings I put on the wall are about 2 centimeters larger in every direction than the actual window, which leaves a little bit of space for the steel that I'm going to weld in for the frame and also for error. The Sharpie rests really nicely on top of the 2x4 and it allows you to draw a relatively straight line, and then I just take a bunch of different measurements off of the walls or the floor and basically connect the dots. It's a little tedious, but I've had better luck with this than with lasers. This is also the last chance to ask your friends or partner what they think of the design, and in this case, Dana suggested we add 1 additional window to this wall for airflow. So that's what we did. All right, so we got the door marked right there, a window, another window, a area for the vents and electrical wires to come in, and 1 more window over here. So we use a generator to power all of our equipment off-grid on big work days, and then all of the gear I keep in these green boxes with labels. I think they're hunting boxes technically, but they're relatively waterproof, and it's worked out pretty well honestly so far because I don't have a shed or barn or anything to store my gear. I'm starting with the vent just because it's been a while since I worked on shipping containers in terms of like the cutting and the welding portion of the process, so I wanted something easy to kind of ease my way in. Once the hole is cut, I clean up the edges so that later when I'm applying sealant with my fingers, there's nothing really sharp to cut through the gloves, which has happened in the past. Then I build a frame. In this case, I'm cleaning it up just because I want to. There's really no need with the type of welding I'm doing. And then I clean off 1 area just to get started for the welding machine to attach to bare metal. Luckily, our generator can power this welding machine, but I think it can actually run on lower voltage as well. When I first started doing this type of welding, I made everything way too strong, way too quickly. And I've realized it's actually much better to tack weld everything together as gently as possible. Make sure you have it all exactly the way you want, and then at the end weld it all together, because there's really no going back if you make it too strong too quick. This box didn't end up turning out all that square, but that's okay. I'm kind of just trying to build as quickly as possible right now, and to fix something like that is very time consuming. I'm also over welding a lot of this just because I want the practice, and this is kind of like the first piece of the puzzle, but for the other windows and doors, I weld a lot less and also a lot quicker. Afterwards, I clean up the edges 1 more time with the angle grinder just so there's nothing super sharp, and then we clean off the burnt paint and all of the welding residue. This is actually a very important step because if you don't, the sealant won't stick. it just like adheres to the burnt paint and falls right off. I also use a obscene amount of sealant just because we used to live on a sailboat, and I've learned the hard way that it's better to just put a ton of sealant on everything so that it's actually watertight rather than trying to be sparse with it. For the larger openings, I find using a larger cutting disc on the angle grinder works way better for me. It also means you have to change discs less regularly, but I own, I think, 3 different angle grinders, and depending on the spacing of the cut and also how tired my arms are, I do kind of just switch between them. When cutting very, very large openings, I find it helps to keep a little tab at the top and also at the bottom that you cut at the very end. And this way the whole thing kind of just falls gently out. The metal tends to get a lot more wobbly than I realized when I first started building shipping containers. You would think it's super, super rigid, but once you start cutting it to the sides, it actually gets very wobbly, and it helps to keep those tabs and cut them at the very end, just so that it falls out cleanly and doesn't get too wobbly in the middle. Then I take a measurement just to see if the cut hole is actually what I wanted it to be, and use that new measurement to build the steel frame. I think in this case it's 3-inch steel that I'm using. I found with the other containers that the wider the windowsills are, the easier everything gets, just in terms of placing the window, in terms of welding it in, and also if you have a lip on the outside, it makes it so much easier to keep things watertight because it kind of acts as a little roof for each individual window. I start with the bottom plate, tack that into place, and then I'll put the sides in. In this case, I'm using hammer because it didn't quite fit perfectly. Then I do tack welds around the entire frame every 6 inches or so, just because the long pieces of steel have a tendency to bow either in or out, and this helps keep the frame square. Since this is the first window I'm doing on this one, I decided to test it physically, not just with the measuring tape, to see if the window would fit. It ended up fitting just barely, which is great, but it was supposed to be quite a bit roomier than that, so I adjusted my cut outlines for the other windows so that that problem doesn't happen again, because it would just be very devastating if the frame didn't fit the window. Once it's all cleaned up, I put sealant around the inside first, and then afterwards around the outside. On the previous containers, I used tape to make really nice clean lines, but in this case, I'm just trying to be fast with it. So the center window, I waited to cut from the top center just so that it wouldn't swing to the side, and that seemed to work pretty well. It fell nicely out, not in, which is good. The shape of the steel on the front and the back of the containers is actually different than the sides. I find it's a little bit more annoying to cut with an angle grinder, but it actually works way better for placing in the steel frame afterwards, just because it's less wobbly. This frame, I think, is only 2 inches wide. I can't remember exactly, but it's not as wide as the other window I just installed. And you can see it's quite flexible in the center, so you want to hold it up and make sure it's all square before it gets welded into place. I also double check all of the measurements before I do the final round of welding on the frame, just to make sure the window will actually fit. Since this is such a large window, there could be areas where the cut of the initial angle grinder into the steel wall isn't perfectly straight, and that can kind of throw everything off. But this one actually seems to have had a good amount of space on the edges, so I just kept going and sealed it all. Cutting the openings in the container is probably my least favorite part in the entire process, just because Using the angle grinder is like very, very physical work. You also have to really pay attention when you're cutting. And depending if there's weight on the container in different areas, the steel can kind of do some weird stuff like bowing in or out. But this window came together really quickly, and the door honestly as well. I think I'm just getting a little bit better at cutting with the angle grinder because it used to take a long time to cut these openings just because I would have to switch discs so often. And now I kind of have it figured out where it's not taking that many discs to cut an opening. I find that it's easy with the hammer to kind of whack things into place. And because I'm trying to build this very quickly, it's nicer to just kind of see if stuff will fit instead of recutting it to get it all perfect. This is the door frame, so the steel I'm using is way wider because I want an area to step in front of the door, and also I'm hoping that this will help keep water off the door. I'm also installing a vent on the roof just to help with the condensation issue. This is like a special type of vent that fits directly into the corrugate, and we did one in the kitchen. It seems to work totally fine. The fan makes kind of an annoying sound. I think it's like meant for like industrial or commercial use, not like residential. That is a boat level amount of sealant, but this thing is gonna get very, very wet. So hopefully no water comes through. So this is the first shipping container build where I cut out and welded everything before there was any other material inside there, which allowed me to clean it really, really well and also way faster. And if the weather turns, there's also nothing in there that will get damaged, which is nice. So now we're basically ready to go on the next stage of the process. All that we need to do is cover the windows and the door with some tarp. I like to use heavy duty duct tape just because I'd rather have the duct tape tear off a little paint or leave a little residue than use a weaker tape and just have it break the first second a storm comes in. And we tend to have like some sort of thunderstorm activity every 3 or 4 days this summer. I'm also building a little area to put my plywood. This is, I think it's called Columbia Forest Products. It's a special type of plywood that you can get at Home Depot, which doesn't have formaldehyde in it. I think it uses like a soy-based glue. It's really only interior grade. If you get this stuff wet, it breaks almost immediately. So you really want to try and keep it dry while you're building. I also learned the hard way that if you apply a tarp to the floor before spray foaming, it really, really helps with cleanup. And here I am closing the back doors on this shipping container for the last time, which is kind of, yeah, it's a pretty wild feeling. So spray foam was the part of the process that I found most intimidating at the very beginning. It's actually one of my favorite parts now, just because it's really, really cool. It like transforms the container almost immediately and it goes very quickly. I think if you have the option to hire a professional, you'll probably get a higher quality product cheaper, which is surprising. I think there's like very few things where hiring professionals is so much better than doing it yourself in terms of quality and price. But I kind of love doing it. We don't really have the option in this area to hire people, and I also just like don't want to deal with someone else's timing. I basically start by doing a tack coat, which is just like a very quick, thin coat that gives the next couple coats something good to adhere to. And I haven't had any problems with that method. The conditions today while I'm doing this are perfect. It's like 70 degrees outside, super low humidity, and I preheated the tanks at a house with a space heater. So they're up at, I think they're 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and then they cool as you use them. But spray foam is really about clean surfaces and tank temperature. I'm definitely not a spray foam professional, but I kind of love it. And I think when we build our next structure, it's definitely something I'll consider. For larger scale stuff, I think definitely hiring a professional makes sense, but this is kind of like the size of space you can get away with still doing yourself. And I feel like if we end up hiring someone to do it, I'll at least know what to look for in terms of doing a good job. The floor is basically just a couple sheets of rigid foam. I don't think it's gonna like be a warm floor by any measure in the winter, but hopefully it will help a little bit. And it's very, very quick. Putting in the floor with the foam and the plywood takes like half an hour, and then you can get into the framing process. So this is the first shipping container that I'm framing after the spray foam is in and after the windows and everything is cut. So it's a little bit different than what I'm used to, but this seems to be the quickest way to do things because you don't have to clean any of the framing from the spray foam, which creates a massive mess. So we're already getting to the step now of putting in the door. The sooner the door goes in, the better, because it means we can get rid of the tarps and just have like a nice, easy way to get in and out of the container. So I found from the other 2 shipping container builds I did that framing everything after the windows and door are cut goes way, way faster, because basically these 2x4s are just meant to hold the insulation in place and the plywood, but because the container shell is so strong, they're not actually holding much, if any, weight. So you don't need to have too many of them. It just goes way faster to kind of toenail everything into place. Also, because it's such a small space, you can't frame like the traditional way where you would raise an entire wall all at once. You kind of just toenail it into place. And it's honestly one of my favorite parts of the process just because it goes so quickly. Like this whole operation took, I think, half a day. Whereas on the other containers, we kind of tried to plan it all out and had blueprints and everything. And it ended up being way more work and just like way overbuilt. To hold the windows in, we basically just cut strips of plywood. And then I found if you use a couple clamps and some 2x4s on the steel frame, it's just kind of like a nice backup safety measure when you're putting the windows in so that they don't by accident fall through. We basically just attach everything with a couple screws temporarily to hold it, and then later we'll go through and reinforce. The 2x4s with the clamps also help to make sure that you get the windows exactly how you want them. And then once everything was placed, I went through with some spray foam and just sealed up the edges, which helps with insulating and also with waterproofing. So the next step is to finish insulating the container. In this case, we're using hemp wool, which is a natural insulation material that I just really love because we used it on our van build way back in the day. And so the smell is super nostalgic for us. But I think if you're hiring professionals to do the spray foam, I wouldn't recommend using this insulation. I would just do a thicker layer of spray foam and none of this. But I have a bunch of this material left over from the other 2 containers. And it's really easy to work with just because it's non-toxic. So it's not like crazy itchy and it doesn't irritate your eyes. All right, so I just wanted to show you real quick before we start insulating how everything turned out on the inside. All 3 windows are fully installed and the door is as well. We have spray foam in the gaps for now, and then this will need to get cut and then we'll seal them fully with sealant. But right now we're just cleaning out the container and preparing. We got our friend Carmel.
Hi.
I did a new system here where I have a piece of 2x4 this direction and one this direction, which allows you when you're toenailing the boards in for them not to slide backwards, because we realized from the other builds that in order for the plywood sheets to line up really nicely, these 2x4 studs really need to be as close to perfect as possible. And that's actually pretty hard to do just because 2x4 studs are rarely straight and just like not that great quality in general. So this kind of allows everything to line up really, really nicely. We framed the windows with some plywood for now, and our friend Noah is about to make red oak window sills, which will cover all of this and make it look really, really nice. The spray foam insulation looked like it cured perfectly. We had no issues with that. And I think after today we should be fully insulated and also watertight. The windows I designed a little differently than the other two containers. I placed them as far back into the container as possible so that they have metal overhangs on the outside, and hopefully this means less rainwater hits them, so they are fully waterproof. A lot of lessons applied on this container from the other two containers, and this one has come together by far the quickest. This is day 6, and I think by the end of the day we should be like 80% done. So this is one of the steps in the process where having multiple people really speeds things along. Here our friend Carmel is placing the insulation and I'm outside cutting it. So if you have just a team of 2 doing this, it saves a lot of time. And then our friend Noah is already working on the next step of the process right now, which is building red oak window frames. These slide into place before the walls go in, just so that it's really easy to get wall measurements. And he actually built them so well that we didn't even need to screw them in at first because they were so close to perfect. They kind of just held themselves in place. It's also nice building a box outside the container and then carrying it in because it frees up workspace and it ensures that the window frame is actually perfectly square, since some of the 2x4 wall studs might not be like perfectly square. Simultaneously, Carmel and I are sealing the outside of the windows because there's a storm coming in, so we wanted to make sure everything was watertight before it started to rain. And then we got to work putting in the wall panels. We use brad nails for this, and it seems to work very, very well. No panel has ever fallen out. I think it's plenty strong enough. And if you mark where the studs are with pencil on the floor and on the ceiling, it's really, really easy to make sure you're hitting the nails into the right spot. And if you have a team of 3, this step goes really, really fast. Even with 2 people, you could cruise through this. I think this took us like 1 afternoon to get the walls in place, and then the ceiling is like a whole separate puzzle. I tried using duct tape this time around to hold the insulation in place, and it actually worked pretty well, but this is one of my least favorite parts of the process, just getting insulation in your eyes and all over you. It's just like not fun, and for some reason it never really feels like you're doing a good job just because there's like always different areas where you could have added more insulation. But once it's in, we add red oak trim, custom cut, to clean up all of the edges and then screw the windows in place, or the window frames in place, so that they don't slide around anymore. The trim kind of just like makes it all look nice and ties it all together. And I also build everything in such a way that it requires trim just because I'm building relatively quickly. But the wall seams we actually did such a good job with that we decided not to add too much vertical trim. All right, so let's take a look at where we are. All 3 windows are in. The trim work is done, and it's been raining a ton and none of them have leaked, so I would say we are fully waterproof at this point. The door also does not seem to be leaking water. All of the paneling is done. The vent is ready to go. The trim work is done on some of the edges. And this is kind of a really, really nice place now to begin the interior build. We're gonna have a couch over there, a desk over there, and a huge wall of storage. So yeah, this is like honestly a pretty incredible transformation. It was me working for, I think, 3 days alone, and then 3 days with help. And all of the materials were already assembled, so that went quick. But we did have to deal with some pretty intense weather. So I feel like in an ideal world, you could probably get this done even quicker. Potentially, I think the quickest you could do it is maybe 3 days. If you had some people helping you and you knew what you were doing. But this is how the exterior looks. I decided to go really rough with the sealant because my plan is to tape and paint this whole area to get nice clean lines. When you do neat sealant work, it takes a really, really long time to set the tape, remove the tape, clean everything with acetone. So I just wanted a really nice waterproof structure as quick as possible, and then we'll clean it up later. This is my favorite window. It matches the window on the bedroom, and it just gives a really nice view of the meadow. Another key feature of this build is I decided to put the windows as far back as possible in the steel frames. So very, very little rainwater actually hits these windows as opposed to the other windows. The vent is all ready to go to run solar cables. And yeah, pretty happy with how that turned out. Thanks so much for watching this shipping container build, and a big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Squarespace makes it quick and easy to build your own website, but in my opinion, the best part of all is that the site will look beautiful and run well, so you get to focus on the creation part while they tackle the logistics and code. Opening our online store has been one of our best decisions because it allows us to connect with people all over the world, which has been an incredible experience. The beauty of working with Squarespace is that as you grow, your website can grow alongside you seamlessly. If you'd like to try out some of their awesome templates, head to squarespace.com/wildweroam for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you!